This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi there, and welcome to this episode of Ken Bates's Conversations. This time I chat with American Scot Kat Cary from Edinburgh, and I began by asking her about her roots in the USA.
I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on a farm right outside of it. Not a well-off farm, uh, and so close to Canada. I mean, I visited Canada when I was a little kid, um, in the upper Midwest, and kind of in the middle of everything, kind of in the middle of this big landmass in a way that it's kind of hard to comprehend when even now living here. And when I was 19, I enlisted in the Navy, and I ran away because I wanted to see the world.
How long were you in the Navy for?
I was in 12 and a half years. I got medically retired.
Must have been. You say you travelled the world then. You must have seen quite a few places in your time.
Yeah, I did. September 11th happened right after I joined, if that tells you anything. And I was stationed in Bahrain in the Middle East. When I tell people I've been to Diego Garcia, their eyes usually get big. In America, that doesn't mean much because there's just an airstrip there that we would fly out of if it's, if there's stuff in the Indian Ocean. But I would actually have been in the Air Force if I was in the British military. My first time in Scotland was working in Inverness, working at a Kinloss Air Force Base with the Nimrods back when they still operated.
What were your impressions of Scotland when you first came here?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, I had been in Iraq for 6 months directly before that. So imagine the green of Inverness in May and the beauty of it. And then imagine that after 6 months of deserts and tents. um, so, I mean, I kind of fell in love with it. I know that when we were looking at places to move, that's kind of why Scotland went out. It's because of my experiences of not only how beautiful it was, but how wonderful the people were. Because people are like, why do you, Inverness, you like us? Why are we special? It's like, because you're friendly and, people were just marvelous there. And I mean, we go up to Inverness, not this summer, but we have in summers before and really enjoyed it.
So
Um,
a lot of people have said
and the
about.
whiskey trail a time or two. What?
I said a lot of people have said that they found the people really welcoming in Scotland, and that was your experience too.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I moved here, my family and I, we moved here before or right after the Brexit vote, and we didn't get too involved in the independence movement because we didn't feel like it was our place until we went on our first Indie March. And we did it because, I mean, my kids don't remember America. They were born there, but they're pretty Scottish. So, we went on the march for their future with a pal of ours, and we kind of, realized that our voices do matter and they are worth it. And that's the kind of spirit and the welcoming attitude that attracted us here in the first place.
Just going back to when you moved here, did you make any decisions as to which part of Scotland you were going to move to? Did you consciously decide to live in Edinburgh? I guess it was Edinburgh that you moved to when you first came here.
Well, the only reason that we could afford to live here is because um, from being in the military, and my husband was in the military as well, we have the GI Bill, which gives us funding, and we get a stipend every month. So we were looking at what universities accepted us. I was pregnant with my daughter, who's about to turn 6, and we found out, oh, hey, this program, if you look it up, that we're intending to use anyways, will pay for overseas universities. So we started looking it up because we didn't want our kids in the public school system in the US. My husband and I were both in high school when Columbine happened, and it's not gotten any better. So, and we don't have the kind of money to be able to afford private school. So I think the ONS statistics came out shortly after that. We're American. We don't speak another language fluently. So we were limited by that. And it really came down between Scotland and Dublin. And then it was Edinburgh over Glasgow just because of the specific programs that they had. Because I did a postgraduate degree in psychology. originally. So that's why I was kind of outside the realms of politics, with my head in the books for our first year here. But the research psychology department at Edinburgh. So it was really the university and the specific research that they were doing that brought me here, or brought us here.
What sort of research were you doing, if you don't mind me asking?
I was doing research on how to increase retention of women, and well, I only got as far as women in a master's, right? You can't get to everybody, but all underrepresented groups in STEM subjects. So a lot of stats, and I did research with personality. There's a little bit genetics as well in the differential psychology departments. Genetics and intelligence and personality, which it's organized a little bit differently in Edinburgh. And it was really, really, really interesting research that, to me, but not to anybody else. I studied women in the military, if they're more likely to stay in a STEM career, because I'm a woman that was in the military that moved to a STEM career.
Edinburgh's a little bit different from Inverness, I guess, really, isn't it?
I suppose it was about 6 years in between, 6 or 8 years in between, but we definitely wanted to move somewhere where we didn't need a vehicle. So, because just from the reasons that I was medically retired and everything, driving or riding in a car exacerbates it. So just being able to walk everywhere. I mean, we live in Edinburgh South, and it costs as much as they say it does, but we can walk to work, walk to school. We don't have many other expenses.
Mm-hmm. Scotland is probably culturally very different from America as well.
Parts of it, I feel like I lived overseas. My husband and I met in Hawaii, so that's not the continental United States. I feel like the America that I grew up in, the values that I was taught growing up, civic responsibility, all those kind of things were really reflected here. We all felt, the four of us, well, my daughter turned 2 right after we moved here, but my son, my husband, and I, we all felt like we came home when we moved here. And we've lived here for 4 years now, so I think the honeymoon period's worn off a bit, but we still love it. We'd still choose it. Even saying, if we moved to Dublin, all this Brexit stuff wouldn't have been anything that bothered us. But that doesn't matter. I'd do it all again.
Mm.
I really love it here.
You talked a bit about Brexit there, Mr. to talk about what's going on with Brexit at the moment. And you were here during that time. Has it had any impact with Brexit? Has it had any impact on you being able to stay in Scotland?
No, but I'm in the category that people will be in the immigration category. So I don't see how the infrastructure, we'll all be affected by it. I will go through the same process as everyone else, but now there's going to be so many more people going through that process. And then with Erasmus, with the education sharing, the knowledge sharing, that's going to really affect me being a grad student. Because now, and I study EU politics, international European politics now, so that's very much, Brexit has been a very central part of my life. I've tried to look past it and everything, but still in my research and my studies right now, it always has something to do with it.
Do you, as you say, Brexit's going to affect all of us. And we're seeing now, especially, and I'm sure you might have an opinion on this, that we're seeing some stuff with Boris Johnson and this, what they're calling a power grab on Holyrood, and how within the union, there's these rules and regulations that are going to apply to which are devolved matters, which were devolved to Europe from Europe to Scotland, and that the UK government are going to try and grab those back at Westminster. What are your thoughts about that, Kat?
My thoughts are, I'm frustrated because I I learned about this a few years ago. And I don't know why people weren't, I mean, people made a little bit of a fuss, but I have a little bit of anger and fatigue because that is the way it has been. Like, I remember Nicola Sturgeon saying it. It's not a surprise because they said that's what's going to happen. So that's sort of why I've been against Brexit the whole time.
Yeah. Obviously, while you've been here, you've seen the comparisons between how politics is done in Westminster and politics in Holyrood. Two completely different styles of governance. Would you agree?
Yeah, very much so. I would compare Holyrood more to the European Parliament than to Westminster. And Westminster's a lot of theater and not a lot of substance, to my mind.
Mm. Let's talk about, of course, COVID-19. That's affected all of us. And yet here in Scotland, even if we multiplied the number of people in Scotland to match those in England, for example, the outbreaks here are less, there's more control, and the way that it's been administered and the way it's been dealt with in comparison between Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola's come out on top of this, and she's gained quite a lot of international respect in the way that she's dealing with it. What are your thoughts on this whole COVID-19 scenario? Do you think that we're dealing with it in the best way possible here in Scotland?
Absolutely. I don't think that there's anything. I think it's a very cautious approach, and it's focused on saving lives. And because the people are sovereign in Scotland, it's making sure that every single action is taken to mitigate the problem. And, you know, I don't want to get too into the weeds with it because the whole test and trace program is just more effective than what the UK tried to do. But the test and trace program wasn't trying to reward contracts to developers, right? It involved systems that were already in place. And the Scottish NHS is much stronger and more effective than the NHS in England. And I'm not sure about Wales, but I think they're okay. I can't really speak to them, and I don't want to slag them off. But I know that the Scottish NHS is top notch. And I don't know if I told you, I have a mild case of COVID that I've had for months where I still get a fever every once in a while, but I haven't been really super duper sick. But it's been a process, and I've been calling and in touch with the Scottish NHS and 111 and my GP, and they're very helpful. It's just doing what you're told. And I live 3 blocks away from the Meadows. Never go there on a nice day. But right now during COVID, but it's always crowded this time of year there. So
you've had to shield,
altering our lives a little bit.
Have you had to be?
I'm not shielding anymore.
But you did for a while. That's pretty tough going, not being able to go anywhere and having to isolate in such a way.
It was a little bit, but I think being in the military and being on deployment really, really helped me because I've been used to it. Especially being in aviation, living by a flight schedule, they'll say, you have to be ready to fly within 1 to 4 hours or 12 hours or whatever. And you have to sit in a room, sometimes in a barracks room or in a tent, and just stay there and sit. So my husband and I both lived that life for quite a while. So I feel very fortunate that we just we didn't tackle a huge project. We didn't learn to play the violin or anything, but we've gotten through it with our spirits up. So I feel very lucky.
Okay. I
continue to. It's not over.
No. Well, it's getting better. The figures are still considerably low, very low compared to what we're seeing down in England. I think at the weekend, wasn't it? There was around 140 deaths in England. There was 0 in Scotland and 1 in Wales, and 0 in Northern Ireland. It shows just how different things are being done. Let's go on to independence. You mentioned that you went on your first independence march. Had you always been a supporter of Scottish independence, even from your first visits back in Inverness, back in the day when you were still in the forces?
I don't think I really knew it was a movement. I we decided, I heard about the 2014 referendum almost weeks after we started saving to move here because it took us a few years. Um, and we were watching like the BBC, we were watching as much news as we could, but it was through the British media filter. And even then we were just neutral on it because I don't know, it wasn't my place to say. You know, that's kind of how I thought. I didn't live here yet. And then when we lived here, it really, for me, I went on the first independence march after having lived here for a year, and the lived experience that I had was that Scotland could do better as an independent nation in every way. You know, it doesn't make sense to me why people would want to stay shackled to Westminster. It doesn't work very well logistically. It doesn't, and they can make it more difficult for people to live in Scotland, for people to emigrate here, for people to just, you know, what did they put a stop to, they were going to have safe injection sites, which saves lives in Trump's America that's legalized in a few cities. And Westminster didn't allow Holyrood to carry out that policy, which would have saved a lot of lives. So that the immigration hoops we have to jump through, Brexit, I mean, it didn't take long before we were like, went from neutral to yes.
Was there a light bulb moment when suddenly you suddenly thought, hey, independence really is a good thing? Or was it something that sort of happened over sort of a gradual period of time that slowly you learnt more and more? And
I think that I was always like, when I say neutral, I think I was neutral, but tie goes to independence because I'm American. I think that just kind of something that culturally, you know, I have nothing against the English or anything like that, but there was a reason America fought for independence, and those reasons are still present in Scotland today. You know, if you watch Hamilton, we've been watching a lot of Hamilton in my house lately. There's all those reasons, you see them in Scotland, all those arguments, you see them today. And it's just a couple hundred years. I feel like I'm living in my history books. So it wasn't a light bulb moment. It was more, oh yeah, this doesn't make sense. These laws, these procedures, they're in place to make it more difficult for people to live in Scotland that want to live here.
have you learnt a bit about Scottish history as well, sort of since that interest in the independence, and found out about, you know, the signing in 1707, the Arbroath Agreement and things like that? Did you ever take an interest, or have you taken an interest in the history of Scotland?
Oh, I love history anyways. So, yeah, I don't think I ever became interested in Scottish history. It's just like, oh, I live here. I want to learn more about the place that I live. And I knew that the Declaration of Arbroath was one of the things they used to write the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, both, I think. And I mean, I always liked David Hume. Studying psychology, there's the Scottish Enlightenment has always been part of my studies, even in America, before I moved here, before I even thought of moving here. And I mean, now that I study politics, I've been looking at Scots law, and I will dive into history I'll dive into more historical things when the current situation gets a little bit hard for my mental health. I'll start looking at the history books more. I mean, studying politics always involves studying history, but I also like random Scottish history. I love looking at their daily posts, like just the random out of a page of a book there. It's great.
Some of my listeners probably might not have been to an independence march, and you mentioned that first march that you went to. What did you expect, and was it anything like you expected?
The first march we went on was with a friend we had known, and just an acquaintance that lived in our neighborhood, and we said, oh, well, would we be welcome there? Because sometimes as an American, you can't say you're American. God forbid you say you're an American unless you're a citizen, and even then it's questioned, right? So we didn't know if it was our place, really. I was still studying psychology at the time. I didn't understand the politics of Scotland very well, or even when, I mean, my understanding was very nuanced and different in like bits and pieces here and there. And it was an uplifting experience. I have pictures of my kids like chatting with people. And that's where I first kind of realized that there's this new Scot identity, like that you're not an immigrant, you're a new Scot, and that you have a say just like anybody else here. And that's the first time I realized it. So maybe that's my aha moment of starting my like activism, if you want to call it that, or advocacy for Scottish independence, was after that first independence march.
I myself have been on a couple of independence marches, and in comparison to marches and protests or marches generally in England are very different down south. And you know, there seems to be, well, they are very different. But here,
and in America too.
Yeah, the independence marches are really family-friendly affairs.
Very much so. I didn't catch that last bit.
I was just going to say very little interaction from the police, whereas in a march down south and probably in America, you've got police everywhere, and it's kind of a bit on edge at all times, but it seems to be very different here.
Mm-hmm. And well, since I was in the military, things have changed quite a bit, but it always was, you can go to a march. You've always been able to go to a march, not as a private citizen, but not representing the institute, like the military, if that makes sense. So I never really lived in a place where that was normal in the culture to go do it, you know? So they were expected to be a little bit more rowdy, I suppose. Whereas here, I mean, I've been on I was on the Trump protest march. We've been on on pride marches here, and they're all family friendly. That's just the way Edinburgh is. And in Scotland, I missed the last Glasgow march. I really wanted to go, but I couldn't, my kids could not go through the freezing rain again and a train ride. So I was heartbroken. I really wanted to go.
Independence is very much a big topic of conversation now that the majority of Scots, over 54%, I think the last figures released, showed that of people supporting independence, whether that be through the pandemic or through growing support and with everything that's happening. What do you think is the way forward? We've got this talk of the Section 30, which the Westminster government are saying no to. How do you think that the Scottish government should approach gaining either a referendum or gaining independence for this nation?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked me that, because looking at other countries, I think I don't think of independence as the goal. I think of independence as the next step to being a free nation, because you don't stop at declaring independence or legally being recognized. I look at how it will be. So I think that having the court cases go through and doing the litigation process ahead of either an independence referendum or a unilateral declaration of independence. I'm not a lawyer. I can't, and I'm not an expert on Scottish politics, so I can't speak to which would be a better idea with those two. But I do think that in the international relations and in the wider transatlantic politics aspect, it's really important for Scotland to make sure that we're internationally recognized on day one, because we need to start building our relationships, building our partners, and not be beholden to a different, partner than Westminster, because, you don't want to be like a satellite state of America or Russia or China, because you have to be for, so you don't starve. So while I understand and I would probably benefit from Scotland declaring independence more quickly, I think making sure that the international recognition is there is really important. And I also think that making sure that we don't limit our options in that interim is very, very important, because right now we have the hearts and minds and ears of the world all of a sudden on us going, wait, they are different. Wait, they do things in a very distinctly different way. We want to work with them, which is, this Article 30 case is going through the courts right now. And if they say no, they have to give us a reason and a roadmap. And then it's just litigating it again, so that when Scotland doesn't declare independence eventually, because I have no doubt that it will, from the next day forward, there is a plan and a method in place so that people aren't displaced, or, I think of the worst case scenarios, I suppose, but you really want to be able to declare independence and then live your life the next day better off for it, and not fighting and litigating in courts after that. I see Catalonia, the support for independence are going down, and it breaks my heart. And I worry about that.
Do you think Scotland will get fast-tracked back into the EU again, or do you think there might need to be another referendum to decide whether Scotland wants to go back into the EU if that opportunity arises?
I think that, the EU has said Scotland, we're okay with Scotland. We're not okay with the UK. And especially if there's human rights violations, if we keep doing this the legal way and we keep displaying that Westminster is doing a power grab on previously devolved matters, I have no doubt that Scotland will be fast-tracked.
Somebody mentioned,
let me put it that way.
Yeah. Somebody mentioned to me in an interview last week, it was last week when I recorded another interview, that at present the EU can't make comment because we're still in the transition period. And apparently after the UK has left, then the EU can start giving their opinions and start saying what they want necessarily about Scotland, and they can't be vocal. Do you think is that the case from your aware? Do you know if that is the case? And if so, do you think that the EU will start saying anything and their support publicly for Scotland? And could that have some effect on, maybe some influence on allowing either a Section 30 order or moving it forward as well?
I think that the EU's response and part of the thing that makes the EU so difficult is that they are very measured and diplomatic and very, prudent in everything they say, because they've said all these things about supporting Scotland and welcoming them back in, but they've said it in the sort of measured diplomatic language that doesn't excite people very much. But we're within the acquis, that's one of the big things that I worry about, is that Westminster legislating laws that take us out of the human rights standards that the EU and the ECHR has set to put barriers in the way. But I don't know how vocal the EU will ever be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. The EU weren't very vocal when anything was happening in Catalonia. They seemed to keep very, very quiet about that. And I was expecting for the EU somewhere in the administration to say something at least about the way that, we saw the police beating people going to vote for independence and all that. The EU were silent.
Yeah, it gets really dicey, because in one way, imagine if the EU could come into a member state that they weren't happy with and enforce their will on them. Imagine if the EU could come to Scotland and say, Glasgow and Edinburgh, you're separate, and because we decide that's what's best. You don't really want that, do you? But it's very frustrating, because then they can't act in member state affairs until a certain point. And it's just really, Catalonia breaks my heart. And I think everybody needs to learn the lessons of the order in which you do things to gain independence is almost as important as being independent. Estonia declared independence how many years before it actually realized it? So to my mind, Scotland is independent already, but not in fact, not in the international standards. So I'm happy for it to go through the courts before we start changing our international relations in that kind of outlook. Just from how are we going to stay fed? How are we going to protect the citizens way? But as soon as it's possible to say to Westminster, you have no argument for keeping us in the United Kingdom. As soon as we get that, let's go. We're already gone. That's just our walking papers. It's kind of like going through a divorce, right? You have to do a 6-month separation. It's not really asking for opinions. It's for permission. It's going through the proper procedures so that you're free.
Do you think Scotland will struggle once we gain independence? Will we be financially short? Will it be a struggle? Will there be a recession, do you think, here in Scotland? Or do you think we'll fly from day one?
I think we'll fly from day one as long as we aren't crippled by uncertainty afterwards. That's why I think it's so important to make sure we're internationally recognized on day one. Because if we're not, then we're at the mercy of what Westminster wants to put us through. And that, from my perspective, is terrible things, because I was a kid and the Troubles were going on, and that reached us in America, in the middle of America. And it's not right, and it would get fixed, but being somebody that's been to a conflict zone and been in the military and in war, I don't want anybody to have to fight or die or lose their lives when we can just go through a paperwork drill. But I also understand that there's people that have been fighting their whole lives for independence, and they don't want to hear that either. I don't think my perspective is more important than anyone else's. But an immigrant or a new Scot, someone whose residency status is still under control from the Home Office, I'm a lot more conservative, small c, conservative in my views of how best to attain independence, maybe. Because I don't want to get kicked out. I want to stay living here.
Which leads me to my final question, and the question I ask all my guests is, if somebody was thinking about coming to make Scotland their home and thinking about moving here, what advice would you give them? What would you say to anybody who was thinking about Scotland as a home?
Come on, visit. Come on. We got an extra bedroom. Come on and have a visit. We'll show you around, and guarantee you'll probably want to move here. Start saving your money. We've told plenty of our friends that have jobs that would be able to transfer here easily, going, here you go, look at it. Come over. Come see it. It's better than America right now,
That's brilliant. Kat, thanks ever so much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kat Cary there, talking with me last month.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
That's all for this episode of Ken Bates' Conversations. Until next time, stay safe.